The characteristics of life are the characteristics or the traits that scientists use to determine if something is living or non-living. So they take the characteristics that we see in living things and they look at what they all have in common, and then they can apply those to things that we don't know if they're living or not to determine if they are. Now, this seems pretty obvious to be able to tell if something's living or not, but I want you to think about where might we find something that we don't know if it's living or not. So the major place they're applying this right now is on Mars. As they're discovering things, they're looking at, is it living or not? All living things have some characteristics in common. We call these characteristics the characteristics of life. Now there are two rules that we have to keep in mind when we're using the characteristics of life. The first is all living things must have that characteristic. Otherwise, it's not a characteristic of life. So if any living thing doesn't have that characteristic, we're not going to call it a characteristic of life. And the second rule is that non-living things may have some of the characteristics of life, but if that object is missing even one characteristic, that object is considered not living. Now let's define non-living. Non-living means it is not alive, it never will be considered alive, and it never was alive. And so if something is dead, it was a living thing at one time. So dead things are not considered non-living. They were living. So let's apply these rules now. Based on the rules, is movement a characteristic of life? So what you need to think about is, are there any living things that don't move? So hopefully you thought about the fact that most plants do not move on their own. Coral, for the most part, does not move. So because there are living things that do not move, movement is not considered a characteristic of life. So let's take a look at what those characteristics are. The first one is cells and organization. All living things are made up of cells, and cells are the smallest unit capable of performing all living functions. So this is called cells and organization because your body is organized into systems and organs and tissues. Even individual cells are organized with all of the organelles inside of them. So let's apply those rules again. Is having organs a characteristic of life? So we need to think about, are there any living things that don't have organs, such as a brain or heart or stomach or bones? And if we think about it, plants do not have organs. They have cells. Those cells are organized into tissues, which are groups of cells, but those tissues are not organized into organs. Let's look at a simpler organism, bacteria or other organisms that have only a single cell. That's not enough cells to make up an organ, and so not all living things have organs. Therefore, that cannot be used as a characteristic of life. Our next characteristic is energy and metabolism. So all organisms need energy in order to perform daily functions. Some organisms, such as you, obtain that energy by eating other organisms. Everything that you eat came from another organism. So if you're eating a hamburger, that bread came from wheat, that cheese came from milk, from a cow, the meat definitely came from a cow, the lettuce came from a plant. So everything you eat used to be an organism. Other organisms produce food molecules by taking in energy in other forms. So you know plants use solar energy, photosynthesis. Some bacteria use chemical energy, chemosynthesis, using that energy from chemicals instead of from the sun. And so metabolism, that word, means the sum total of all chemical reactions occurring in the body. Put a star next to that or underline or highlight that definition. You need to know the definition of metabolism. Let's apply those rules again. Is eating a characteristic of life? So we need to think about, are there any living things that don't eat in terms of taking food into their body and breaking it down into smaller molecules? And of course, plants don't eat. They produce food molecules using solar energy, but they don't actually eat food. So we're going to call this characteristic energy and metabolism. We are not going to call it eating. The next characteristic of life is reproduction. Now there's no definition written here because reproduction is pretty self-explanatory. So if you'd like to add to your notes, reproduction is creating offspring, individuals replacing themselves, you are welcome to do that. The next characteristic is heredity. Now, as organisms reproduce, they pass on their traits in the form of DNA to their offspring. The next characteristic is homeostasis. Now, if we break down this word, homeo means same, and stasis means staying or standing. So homeostasis literally means staying the same. It is the maintenance of a stable internal environment. So putting that in plain English, keeping all conditions constant in the body. Now, I told you blue in italics, you don't necessarily have to write. What I've done here is I've given you the definition in plain English and I've given you the scientific definition. You may write down whichever of the two makes more sense for you. So there are certain conditions that must stay constant in the body. If it gets too high, your body works to bring it back down. If it gets too low, your body works to bring it back up. So for example, temperature, you know that constant that your body should keep is 98.6. If your temperature gets too high, you sweat to cool down to bring it back to normal. If you get too cold, you shiver or you get goosebumps. Those are two ways that your body is attempting to raise your body temperature. If your water level gets too high, you pee it out to lower that water level to normal. If your water level gets too low, that feeling of thirst is that signal to your body to drink so you can raise the water level again. You also need to keep constant ion concentrations. Those ions are potassium, calcium, salt, and so your body is working to maintain all of these things at a constant level. Non-living things, if any conditions are not where they should be, if they're out of whack, then it doesn't function. If your body is out of whack, it works to fix it. If any of these conditions are too far out of the normal, your temperature is way too high or way too low, that can lead to death. And so homeostasis, bringing your body back to that normal condition, is critical. Our next characteristic doesn't have a definition under it because growth and development is fairly self-explanatory. Living things grow, develop, and change. Our next characteristic is called response to stimuli. So a stimulus is just something that elicits a response. It causes a response to occur. And so this is really response. Organisms react, they respond to living and non-living things around them. And so some examples. Prey run to avoid being eaten. That running is a response. Plants grow towards the light. That growth is a response. We put on a jacket when we're cold. So those are responses, reactions to living or non-living things happening around us. The next characteristic is needs water. Again, this is self-explanatory. The last characteristic is exchange gases. Some organisms breathe in oxygen, like you do, and release carbon dioxide as a waste product. Plants also take in carbon dioxide and release oxygen as a waste product. Now, a lot of people think plants don't need oxygen. Plants actually also take in oxygen and release carbon dioxide. And so next semester, we'll talk about the fact that plants do both of those processes, but we're still not going to call this needs oxygen because there are some bacteria for which oxygen is toxic. So not all living things need oxygen, but all living things exchange gases.